Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 3 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled The Legionary Movement. Again, I have no housekeeping announcements to make for this week, so without further ado, let's start the show. In the previous episode of our series on Romania's interwar fascist movement, known as the Iron Guard, we covered the narrative from about 1924 to 1927. The Iron Guard, officially known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, had its origins in a student protest movement that arose in Romania in 1922. A young law student named Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu sought to channel the movement's energy into more overtly political efforts, but when he was largely unsuccessful in this, he and a number of co-conspirators plotted to carry out a campaign of terroristic assassinations of those who they deemed most responsible for the nation's woes, primarily Romanian politicians and the Jewish bankers they believed financed them. The conspiracy was quickly discovered and the culprits were sent to prison. However, they were soon after acquitted due to a technicality in the law. Upon regaining his freedom, Codreanu sought to continue his efforts organizing among the students at the University of Iodachi, but in this he was constantly hampered by the local police prefect, Constantin Manciu. In retaliation, Codreanu personally assassinated Manciu in broad daylight. He was arrested and faced another trial. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on his side, and despite the fact that the location of the trial was changed twice, he was acquitted once again. By this time, the student protest movement had largely fizzled out, and so Codreanu continued his political efforts within the framework of the League of Christian National Defense, a political party founded by his mentor, Professor A.C. Cuza. It was not long before Codreanu and Cuza began to disagree on matters of strategy. Cuza had been organizing the League along the lines of any other political party, meaning that membership was open to all. Codreanu, by contrast, wanted to instill a measure of discipline within the party's ranks. So to avoid creating a rift within the party, Codreanu opted to go to France for a time to continue his interrupted studies at Grenoble. When a general election was called in Romania in 1926, Codreanu rushed home to help organize the LANC's electoral efforts. He put himself forward as a candidate, and although he lost, the LANC did manage to win a little under 5% of the vote, and sent 10 of its members to the Romanian parliament. No small feat for a party that had just been formed 3 years prior. In spite of this, the LANC would implode in on itself due to interpersonal conflicts within its ranks. With the leadership fatally split, the League no longer appeared to be politically viable. In light of these events, on June 24, 1927, Codreanu officially founded the Legion of the Archangel Michael. The inspiration for the Legion had come to him while he was being held at the Bucharesti prison, awaiting trial for the students' conspiracy of 1923. Being incarcerated gave him plenty of time to reflect on his movement's shortcomings and to devise a new strategy about how to go forward. In his estimation, a new organization, either working within the LANC or outside of it, was needed. Instead of focusing on electoral politics, this theoretical new group would be devoted primarily to education and training. Also while in prison, Codreanu had an encounter with an icon of the Archangel Michael that had such a profound effect on him that he decided to devote the new organization to this saint. Again, it would not be until 1927 that Codreanu would put these plans into motion. Towards the end of the previous episode, we talked at some length about the ideology and organizational structure of the nascent legion. We'll have a lot more to say about the former topic in the near future, so I'll forego a recap of that discussion for now. I'd like to return briefly to the latter topic. If you'll recall from the last episode, the basic organizational unit of the Legion was called the Nest. Nests were regionally based cells of Legionaries, each consisting of 3 to 13 members, among whom was one that the Nest members themselves appointed as their leader. This was a very non-traditional method of organizing a political movement, and for Codreanu, the decision to organize the Legion along these lines was a strategic and pragmatic one. As he explains in his autobiographical work, For My Legionaries, quote, "At the time that the League was founded, there existed a widespread current of support which had to be urgently tapped. while when the Legion came into existence, there was no such current of support for us, but only sparse, isolated men scattered among the towns and villages. The leader of a movement must take reality into account in the greatest earnestness. My basic reality was the single man, and I gave each of these people an opportunity to gather around him in a group according to his abilities and with himself as leader." End quote. In Codreanu's estimation, the organizational structure provided a number of clear advantages. By allowing nests a wide degree of autonomy, he could ensure that local issues were resolved at a local level. In time, the structure would allow for the creation of a sizable cadre of experienced leaders. In 1933, Codreanu wrote a manual providing rules for the leaders of nests. Here, he laid out the 6 laws by which each nest should be guided. They are as follows. Quote, 1. The law of discipline. Legionary, be disciplined, for only thus can you win. Follow your leader through thick and thin. 2. The law of work. Work every day. Put your heart into it. Let your reward not be gain, but the satisfaction that you have laid another brick to the building of the Legion and the flourishing of Romania. 3. The law of silence. Speak little and say only what you must. Speak only when necessary. Your oratory should be deeds, not words. You should accomplish. Let others talk. 4. The law of education. You must become another person, a hero. In the nest, become completely educated. Get to know the Legion well. 5. The law of reciprocal help. Help your brother who falls into misfortune. Do not abandon him. 6. The law of honor. Go only along the path of honor. Fight and never be a coward. Leave the path of infamy to others. Better to fall in an honorable fight than to win by infamy. End quote. Codreanu summarized the objectives of the nests overall in the following way, quote, all these nests forming the Legion are tasked with the mission to take control of the public spirit, of the national economy, of all directions of our public life, liberating them from the influence of the occult Jewish power, and working towards a new Romania through the implementation of vast reforms with a fascist character in all directions of our state life. End quote. For the Legion, the cult of Saint Michael the Archangel would take on great importance, and the saint's feast day was celebrated annually. Codreanu designated this day, November 8th, 1927, as the day on which all members of the incipient Legion would take their first vow. In advance of this event, Codreanu dispatched people to various significant locations in Romanian history, mainly the sites of famous battles or grave sites of Romanian national heroes. They're instructed to collect a small sample of the earth. These samples would then be mixed together and placed into small sacks that each of the legionaries would receive upon taking the vow. The idea behind this was to tie the prospective legionaries to the land in a symbolic sense. Codreanu did not include the actual words spoken as the vow that was taken on that day, but by reading his description of the event, one can get a sense of what this vow may have entailed. Quote, on the morning of the 8th of November, 1927, all the legionaries in Iasi met in our headquarters, and several others who took the trouble to come here from other places. Few in number, but strong in our unflinching faith in God, and confident of his aid, strong in our decision and stubborn in our obstinacy to remain unflinching in the face of any storm, strong in our detachment from everything earthly, a fact that can be seen from our desire, our pleasure to bravely break away from our desire, our pleasure to bravely break away from material things and to serve the cause of the Romanian nation and the cross. End quote. The first 2 or so years of the Legion's existence were not the most prosperous, marked by slow growth and material hardship. Although Codreanu had received education in the field of law, he had never received his degree from the university and could not practice the profession. As a result, he struggled to make a living during this time. Quote, my own material situation, as well as that of my comrades, was becoming worse and worse, more pressuring. The road was tough for all of us. We were ostracized in our own country and thus placed into a position where it was next to impossible for us to make a living. End quote. Codreanu was able to get by in part thanks to support from his family, and in part from the revenue from the Legion's newspaper, The Ancestral Land. Of course, poverty extended down to the lower ranks of the Legion as well. Here I will read a quote from a legionary named Dumitriu Banea, who lived in a communal building with 19 other legionaries at the time. Quote, we were so poor it was unbelievable. There was no fireplace, and the inhabitants put several electrical wires on a tile and stuck them into a power socket to get heat. They put one tile at their heads and another at their feet. When my brother could no longer pay his rent, we made room for him in the garage where we kept our truck. We found some planks in the attic and laid some floorboards down. We made him a table and a bookshelf, but I don't remember if we ever made him a bed. At least, he no longer had to worry about rent." End quote. The Legionaries passed nearly 2 years under these conditions, during which time they were largely unable to engage in outreach efforts for lack of funds. The Legion's membership had begun to grow, and its nests were proliferating throughout the country, but thus far Codreanu had resisted calls from the ranks to go among the people, on the basis that the Legion was not yet strong enough to engage in such activity. This changed in 1929, when the decision was made to go to the masses. Codreanu explains his rationale, quote, "More than 2 years had passed since the Legion came into being. Our nests multiplied across the country. The need was now felt to strengthen the movement by using and stimulating these small nuclei to work. The only legal means of bringing about nationwide measures for solving the Jewish problem was through political avenues. This presupposed contact with the masses at large. Whether good or bad, this was the method that the law had placed at our disposal, which we, sooner or later, had to follow." End quote. And so, in keeping with this decision, Codreanu set off on a speaking tour of sorts through the Pruth River Valley, beginning in the town of Beresti. For geographic context, the Pruth River today forms the border between Romania and Moldova. At Beresti, local authorities denied Codreanu permission to hold any sort of gathering. To them, he offered the following rebuke, quote, "The interdiction you confront me with is neither right nor legal. Everyone has the right to hold meetings in this country. Germans, Hungarians, Turks, even Jews. Is it only I who does not have this right? Your measure is an arbitrary one, and being illegal, I shall not obey it. I shall hold the meeting at any cost." End quote. True to his word, Codreanu went ahead with the meeting, while local gendarmes attempted to prevent the locals from attending. Addressing a crowd that had gathered in the village churchyard, Codreanu delivered an address. Quote, "Let us all unite, men and women, to carve for ourselves and for our people a new destiny. The hour of Romanian resurrection and deliverance is approaching. He who believes, he who will fight and suffer, will be rewarded and blessed. New times knock at our gates. A world with an infertile and dry soul is dying, and another is being born, belonging to those who are full of faith. In this new world, everyone will have his place, not based on schooling or intelligence, but above all, in accordance with his faith and character." End quote. This address had the tone more of a religious sermon than a political speech, and there was a good reason why this was the case. As we discussed in the previous episode, the Legion's leadership refused to put forward a concrete political program, and instead sought to create a new idealized man who would be capable of solving the political issues facing the nation. In other words, the Legion's earliest political campaigns resembled a religious revival more than a series of popular demonstrations. Again, this decision not to outline a political program was intentional. By appealing to people's religious sensibilities, they were able to quickly gain a devoted following of people who had become used to the empty promises of politicians in recent years and had become disaffected. After delivering this speech, Codreanu went to the next village down the road. The first meeting at Beresti established the general pattern that was to characterize the Legion's political campaigns going forward. Codreanu and his legionaries would be forbidden to hold a meeting in a certain village by the local authorities, but they would hold the meeting anyway, despite these attempts to discourage them. In the small villages, the legionaries were generally received rather warmly by the populace. As Codreanu writes, quote, "We went on. Less than 3 miles away we came to Slivna. It was getting dark, yet people were expecting me with lighted candles. A nest of legionaries came to meet me at the edge of the village. I spoke here too. Then I headed for Komeneshti. Here too people were expecting me with lanterns and candles, while the young men sang. People received me joyously no matter what party they belonged to. We were strangers, yet it seemed as though we had been friends for ages. Enmities melted. We were all one soul, one people, one nation. In those villages, as I sang and spoke to the people, I felt how I was penetrating into those undefined depths of the soul where the politicians with their borrowed platforms could never descend. There, into those depths, I planted the roots of the legionary movement, where no one will ever be able to pull them out." End quote. In January 1930, Codreanu decided to continue touring the countryside to mobilize support for the Legion. This time he would go into Bessarabia, a region in eastern Romania that now largely corresponds to the modern country of Moldova. The logic behind campaigning there specifically, in the region of the country that had the highest concentration of Jews in the entire nation, was that the Christian population of Bessarabia, being familiar with their Jewish neighbors, were thought to be more likely to harbor resentments against them that the legion could then exploit. As Codreanu explained, quote, "The Bessarabian peasant population, too, since the unification of Romania at the end of the First World War, had felt no improvement in its lot. For, though it was delivered from Russian occupation, it fell under the domination of the Jews. It was purely and simply prey to them. For 12 years it has been exploited and bled by the communist Jews in a worse manner than the most tyrannical regime known in history has exploited any human society." End quote. The campaign in Bessarabia followed the same basic trajectory as in the early legionary campaigns elsewhere in the country. That is to say, the legionaries would be prohibited by local authorities from holding these meetings, and they would defy these orders and hold the meetings anyway. During this time, the legionaries conscientiously sought to style themselves as religious warriors of a bygone era. Quote, "In the first group, there were 100 riders, each carrying a flag, and all with feathers in their caps, many wearing green shirts. Each had a white cloth sewn onto his shirt. We looked like some crusaders who had marched in the name of the cross against a heathen enemy to free the Romanian people." End quote. Codreanu also reprints an excerpt from one of the speeches that he delivered while in Bessarabia. Quote, "We will not abandon you to the Jewish slavery now oppressing you. You will be the master of the fruit of your labor, master over your land and country. The dawn of a new day is approaching, and in this fight that we have begun, all we expect you to give is faith, faith to the death, and in exchange you will receive justice and glory." End quote. As Codreanu outlined in For My Legionaries, 3 groups of people formed the base of support for the Legion in these early years. Quote, "My basic reality was the single man, a poor peasant in some village, an unfortunate sick working man, an uprooted intellectual." End quote. In other words, these 3 primary constituencies were the peasantry, the workers, and students. I believe it's worth briefly discussing each of these groups and their relationship to the Legion in turn, beginning with the students. The legionary movement, with its origins in the student protests of the early 1920s, naturally looked to students as a base of support. Historians have noted the fact that Romania had a class of intelligentsia disproportionately large compared to the general population. In other words, Romanian universities produced more graduates than there were available jobs. In his study of the Legion's ideology, Professor Constantin Iordachi describes how this economic phenomenon helped give rise to fascism in Romania. Quote, "The material hardship of student life, accompanied by the prospects of job scarcity and intellectual unemployment, caused frustration and alienation, generating strong student protest movements. Discontent was directed against ethnic minorities, whose superior social status was found responsible for the pauperization of Romanian students and university graduates." End quote. As we've already seen, various figures had sought to channel this widespread discontent among students into political action. The LANC was created for this purpose, at least in part. When the Legion split off from the LANC, it had the unintended effect of causing some disorder within the student movement. In August 1927, shortly after the Legion's formation, a student congress was held at Piatra Neamt to decide which organization the students should throw in their lot with. Anti-Legion students argued that the Legion were a bunch of religious fanatics led by a megalomaniac. The pro-Legion students, on the other hand, argued that the difference between the LANC and the Legion was not an ideological difference, but a strategic one. The Legion was clearly the superior organization because of their commitment to taking direct action and their willingness to engage in violence to achieve their goals. As Codreanu explained, quote, "This violence is the violence of national exasperation against foreign exploitation. Only national reasons prompted us to choose the way of the gun." End quote. Codreanu's arguments did not succeed in winning over all those present, and the student movement would remain split between the supporters of the Legion and the supporters of the LANC. Over the next few years, these 2 factions would engage in street battles and political intrigues against each other. But by 1933, it appeared that the Legionary faction had won over a critical mass of students to their side. That year, a student named Ion Benea assumed the presidency of the Stephen the Great's Students' Association, the primary student organization in Romania. He declared, quote, "The student movement has begun anew. It is led by the Legionaries." End quote. The next group to discuss are the peasants. As I've made a point to emphasize in prior episodes, peasants made up the overwhelming majority of the Romanian population during the interwar period. Precise numbers are difficult to ascertain, but based on what I can surmise, I'd say that peasants made up approximately 80% of Romania's population, although this estimate could be on the low end. Until very recently, Romanian peasants had lived in a state of de facto serfdom. Although the agrarian reforms of 1921 broke up the larger estates and redistributed much of their land, this did little to ameliorate the peasants' material conditions. In this mass of disaffected peasants, the Legion found its natural constituency. Using populist messaging, they could find ways to channel their discontent towards their own enemies, namely the Jews and Romanian political establishment. Appealing strictly to the peasants' material interests would not be sufficient in and of itself. The Legion sought to appeal to peasants in other ways. One of their strategies was to differentiate themselves from Romania's political elites. They employed this strategy from the time that Codreanu went on his first tours of the countryside in the winter of 1929 to 1930. Rather than wearing Western European-style suits, legionaries dressed in peasant folk costumes. When they visited a village, they would often participate in farm work to demonstrate their value to the locals. As one legionary explained, quote, "We went into the fields, and seeing someone filling a cart with hay, one of us would take his place, while the other spoke to him of our doctrine and of our struggle." End quote. Religion also played a central role in the Legion's efforts to evangelize among the peasantry. As I've already mentioned, Codreanu and the Legionaries styled themselves as crusaders against the enemies of Christendom. Critics of the Legion would sometimes accuse them of creating a cult of personality around Codreanu, making him into a messianic figure. A contemporary politician named Constantin Archangel offered the following critique, quote, "It was thus that these groups of students spread into the villages, silently helped the peasants with their work, repaired roads and bridges, spaded channels for water and sprang wells, then left announcing that in the following days, the one who had to come would come to the village. And indeed the captain came, riding a white horse, and accompanied by several young men. He used to stop in the center of a village, get off his horse, kiss the earth, and depart without a word. People who watched this, with their eyes open, shook their heads and whispered, 'Was this the saint?' Some legionary agents then spread into the visited villages, and hiding their real identity under all kinds of pretexts, completed the action of conquering souls." End quote. A sociological study of the village of Gigoesti in western Moldavia reveals that despite the emphasis that the Legion put on the religious side of things, most peasants were more interested in having their material concerns addressed than with religion. According to the study, quote, "More than 50% of villagers generally vote with the government or under the sway of some movement, in which case they try new groups not because they were swayed by the party's ideology, but rather out of the desire to see change, to see what others who have not yet been in power would be able to do." End quote. Whether peasants joined the Legion out of religious conviction or whether they did so in the hope of, to borrow a phrase from Codreanu, whiter bread and a better bed, is ultimately not too important, as either way, peasants would prove to be some of the Legion's most fervent supporters, and would provide it with numerous recruits in the years to come. Finally, that brings us to the workers. And when I say workers, I refer to wage laborers, the proletariat in a Marxist sense. The Romanian working class was rather small during the interwar period, especially relative to the masses of peasants. By my estimation, they made up between 7 and 10% of the overall population, but again, this figure could be off. Although the workers were not necessarily seen as a natural constituency for the Legion, after the stock market crash of October 1928, the Legion sought to win over the workers to their cause. If you'll recall from the first episode of this series, in 1922, Codreanu had been a member of an organization called the Guard of National Consciousness. In addition to breaking strikes and organizing counter-protests, the Guard had begun looking into forming new nationalist workers' unions aligned with the state. They did not make much headway with these efforts, but the idea had nonetheless been planted in Codreanu's mind about the potential of converting the working class over to the nationalist cause. The Legion could make a similar appeal to the workers as it did to the peasants, by linking the social and national questions. In other words, the Legion could blame the capitalist exploitation to which the workers were subjected specifically on Jews, thereby portraying the Jews not only as class enemies, but national enemies as well. The idea, of course, being that once the Jewish problem was solved, the workers would find their conditions drastically improved. Competing with the Legion for the hearts and minds of Romania's working class were, of course, the Communists. Rhetorically, the Legion dealt with their ideological opponents by denouncing communism as a Jewish conspiracy to subvert the nation. As one Legionary propaganda leaflet explained, quote, "When Legionaries fight against communism, they are not also fighting against the workers. Communism is not a workers' movement, but a Jewish doctrine that exists only to serve people without a fatherland." End quote. Legionary theoretician Mihai Stălescu went into greater detail explaining the ideological differences between the Legion and their communist rivals. Quote, "The Romanian worker could do nothing but reject the internationalism and the atheism of the Bolsheviks. Moreover, the worker is not hostile to right-wing action so long as it is revolutionary, anti-bourgeois, and tends to demolish the current ruling system to replace it with a dictatorial system in order to destroy the existing ruling capitalist minority." End quote. Essentially, the Legion was willing to borrow from Marxism concepts like the emancipation of labor, but rejected many of its other aspects. Although converting workers over to the nationalist cause had been a long-held dream of Codreanu's, it's worth restating that it was not until after the onset of the Great Depression, specifically the period of recovery that followed, that the worker question assumed any real importance in the Legion's overall strategy. From that time onward, however, the Legion would constantly try to portray itself as the true defender of the workers and their rights. That should be enough about the Legion's constituencies. Hopefully now you have a better idea of why different groups within Romania supported the Legion, and the various strategies that the Legion used to win them over to their cause. We left the narrative off in 1930, when Codreanu set out on the Legion's first campaigns in Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bessarabia. Scarcely had a week passed since the conclusion of the Legion's tour of Bessarabia, then Codreanu received a deluge of letters and telegrams from Bessarabian peasants, asking him to come to their villages. He was hardly in a place to turn them down, as he explains, quote, "During the 2 weeks following the rally in Cahul, the news about the Legionary spread like lightning among all the Christian people of southern Bessarabia, from village to village all the way to the banks of the Dniester. That is, news of a beginning of deliverance from the Jewish slavery that had inflamed the hearts of the poor peasants." End quote. Codreanu met with the rest of the Legionary leadership in Iasi before heading out for Bessarabia. A particularly enthusiastic Legionary proposed marching across the entire length of the region all the way to the Dniester River that formed the border with the Soviet Union. Codreanu was receptive to this idea, but he did have some reservations. Namely, he was worried about further confrontation with the forces of the state. The solution to this problem, as Codreanu envisioned it, necessitated the creation of a new organization. This would be a subdivision of the Legion, a sort of paramilitary wing. In his words, to, quote, "combat Judeo-Bolshevism," end quote. In practice, the true enemies of this new organization would be the local authorities, who were more often than not hostile to the Legion's activities. This new organization would be known as the Iron Guard. As time went on and the Iron Guard earned an infamous reputation, the paramilitary wing of the Legion of the Archangel Michael would be conflated with the Legion as a whole. Thus, people would begin to refer to the entire organization as the Iron Guard. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Although the Iron Guard had been formed for the unstated purpose of fighting back against what its members saw as the arbitrary authority of the state and its representatives, it would appear that Codreanu was still anxious to avoid a major conflict with the state, at least for the time being. In advance of his march into Bessarabia, Codreanu met with the Minister of the Interior, Alexandru Vaida Voivode, to secure permission to campaign in the region. Surprisingly, Codreanu found the Interior Minister somewhat receptive to his views. He described the meeting in the following way, quote, "He kept me there for 3 hours, during which time I realized that he was erroneously informed, both with regard to our movement and to the Jewish problem, which he did not realize in its true light. He took us for some rambunctious youth inclined to solve the Jewish problem by breaking windows. I explained to him then how we saw things, how we consider the Jewish problem an issue of life and death for all Romanians, how their number is overwhelming and inadmissible, how they destroyed the middle-class Romanian towns. I told him what the proportions between Christians and Jews were in Chișinău and Iasi, the danger that they represent in our schools, threatening the alienation of the Romanian leading class and the falsification of our culture. I also explained to him the manner in which we sought to solve these problems. He understood from the beginning what I was talking about, but though a man of his stature surely readily understood the gist of the matter, yet I believe he will never be able to understand us completely, for such is the nature of things. The eyes of 1890 no longer see as well as the eyes of 1930. End quote. Still, Codreanu was ultimately able to secure permission from Vaida Voivode for the march into Bessarabia, on the condition that he personally assumed responsibility for any illegal actions his men might commit. Before the legion began its march, Codreanu claimed to have been visited by two priests from Maramuresh, a region in the northwestern part of Romania, who told him of their misfortunes and begged him to intervene on behalf of the Christians in the region. He reports them saying, quote, "We can no longer bear to see the misfortunes of the Romanians of Maramuresh. We wrote memorandum after memorandum, which we sent all over, to Parliament, the government, the cabinet ministers, the regency, with no reply from any of them. We do not know what else to do. We came by wagon to Iasi to ask the Romanian studentry to not abandon us to our fate. We speak in the name of thousands of peasants from Maramuresh who have grown desperate. We are their priests. We can no longer close our eyes to what we see. Our hearts are breaking with pity." End quote. Moved by this appeal, Codreanu dispatched a group of legionaries to the region to begin organizing among the peasants there. Shortly afterwards, on July 4th, the homes of around 130 Jewish families in the town of Borsa were destroyed by arson. The legionaries that Codreanu had sent into the area were naturally viewed as prime suspects, although Codreanu refuted allegations that his men had anything to do with this, claiming that the Jews of Borsa had set fire to their own homes in order to blame it on the legion. The reality of the situation was that the legionaries had incited the non-Jewish population of the town to begin a pogrom, resulting in the fires that destroyed the homes of most of the town's Jews. In light of these events, Interior Minister Vaida Voivode rescinded his permission for the upcoming legionary march into Bessarabia. In response, Codreanu issued a manifesto proclaiming the innocence of the legion and protesting the minister's decision. The manifesto is rather lengthy, so I will only read a portion of it. Quote, "At Turda, the enemies of the Legion have demanded that the government stop our demonstration, claiming that Transylvania was being set ablaze, that revolution was being started in Bessarabia, and that slaughter and pogroms would commence. They turned out to be contemptible provocateurs in each case, for the Legion kept perfect order and discipline everywhere. We are heading today towards the Dniester in order to turn Bessarabia's face towards Bucharest. But this did not please these mercenaries of communism. Bessarabia must continue to remain prey to Bolshevism and look to Moscow so that they can continue to terrorize through the entire province the political life of Romania." End quote. Despite the highly tense situation, the march into Bessarabia proceeded as planned and appears to have taken place without any noteworthy incident. The men of the Legion were enraged about their perceived mistreatment by the government and the press, and some of them attempted to take matters into their own hands. In July, a legionary who participated in the Borsa pogrom, who took issue with comments made by a certain journalist in Bucharest, broke into the man's office and attempted to assassinate him. Although he failed, later that year, a student named George Beza made an attempt on the life of the Minister of Agriculture, Constantin Angelescu. Codreanu himself was arrested in connection with the most recent assassination attempt. He denied all knowledge of Beza's actions and was quickly released from custody. The press claimed that Codreanu had only been released after condemning the actions of the would-be assassin, but he claimed that this was not the case. In fact, Codreanu became so enraged at this that he was provoked into releasing another manifesto. Quote, "Because the press dared to again becloud the truth, claiming that I branded Beza's gesture, I insist on issuing the following clarification. If Minister Angelescu might have reason to be defended, I believe the youth Beza has as many reasons at least, both in the courts and in the conscience of his countrymen. I declare that I am not going to defend the former by branding the latter, but that I will defend the young Beza and his cause with all my heart and power." End quote. For his comments, Codreanu was subsequently arrested once again in connection with the attempted assassination. Both he and Beza, the would-be assassin, were tried in the final days of 1930 and were acquitted after a week. Meanwhile, the Minister of the Interior, Alexandru Vaida Voivode, was seen as being too soft on the Legion, and in October he was sacked and replaced with a man named Ion Mihailache. Unlike his predecessor, Mihailache had no sympathy for the Legion whatsoever. Using these assassination attempts as pretext, he outlawed the Legion in January 1931. The group's headquarters were raided by police, and numerous documents were confiscated. 6 of its leading members, including Codreanu, were arrested and charged with conspiracy against the state. The arrest warrant read in part, quote, "Whereas the acts of criminal procedure drawn up against Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, attorney Ioanid, age 31, warrant that he committed the act of trying to engage in an action directed against the form of government established by the Constitution, and tried an instigation from which a danger for public safety could have resulted by organizing an association known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, the Iron Guard having the aim of setting up a dictatorial regime, which was to have imposed at a given moment wished by him by violent means, towards which his partisans were prepared and urged through quasi-military drills, orders, directives, and speeches, as well as through publications, posters, emblems, discourses during organized or public meetings." End quote. Codreanu was absolutely incredulous, saying, quote, "This was another hard blow to the head of a Romanian organization that had done nothing illegal, but was only attempting to raise its hand against the Jewish Hydra." End quote. Codreanu and the other leaders stood trial the following month. Codreanu writes of this trial in the following terms, quote, "Both the audience and the magistrates expected to see some proof against us, bombs, munition deposits, dynamite, other weapons, but nothing, absolutely nothing, was produced in evidence. Half an hour after our testimony was completed, the infamous farce collapsed. Finally, we could speak, full of the indignation which for 2 months had been building up within us. All that barrage of lies was broken in the face of truth. All the chains that they had shackled us with came apart. Our lawyers defended us brilliantly." End quote. The verdict was, as it had been so often in the past, acquittal. The prosecutor issued an appeal, which caused the accused to remain in prison for another month before they were once again acquitted in late March 1931. All told, the Legion's leaders had spent a little under 3 months in prison. In regards to this latest episode of political persecution, Codreanu penned the following passage, lamenting the struggle that he and his followers faced. Quote, "O Lord, how come these people do not see that we, their children, are left prey to the enemy blows that fall upon us one after another? O Lord, when will the people wake up and understand the great storm and the cabal directed against them, with so much hatred, determined to stun and slay them?" End quote. Shortly after Codreanu and the others were released from prison, the current government, led by the National Peasants' Party, collapsed in the midst of a conflict with the king. Power was handed over to Nicolae Iorga and the Democratic Nationalist Party, with new elections to be held in June. The Great Depression, which had begun in October of the previous year, had already begun to make its effects felt in Romania. Codreanu recognized an opportunity to play on the people's material poverty and discontent with the government to make a bid for power. But there was one major obstacle standing in the way of this. The Legion of the Archangel Michael, the results of the recent trial notwithstanding, remained outlawed, and thus could not legally stand for election. Codreanu got around this by registering the Legion with the Electoral Commission under a different name, the Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu group. This appears to have been sufficient for the Commission's officials, but Codreanu remarked that the new name did not catch on with most people, who continued to refer to the organization as the Legion or the Iron Guard. The election took place as scheduled, and it was characterized by the usual intimidation and voter fraud, as most other elections in interwar Romania were. The Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu group came in last place, winning only 30,000 votes. However, a short time later, a new opportunity arose. It was announced that there was a vacant seat in Neamt, a county in northwestern Moldavia. This election had high stakes for the future success of the Legion. As Codreanu explained, quote, "The press intended to confer a particular significance on this election because the battle promised to be a fierce one, and its outcome would indicate the succession to power. One noticed the concentration of forces. People ventured prognostications. Some gave victory to the liberals, others to the national peasants. In the midst of battle, some would even place bets. But, naturally, no one spoke at all about us. No one dreamed of placing bets on our victory." End quote. Codreanu became single-mindedly determined to win this election. He put himself forward as a candidate, and brought the full strength of the Legion to bear on Neamt. He called in legionaries from across the country to help campaign for him. These efforts ultimately paid off, as the Legion won 11,000 votes in total. The Liberals, who came in second place, won only 7,000. This victory represented the first electoral success for the Legion since it split off from the LANC 4 years prior. Commenting on the significance of this victory, Codreanu wrote, quote, "And so, our first battle in an open field against the coalesced forces of politicians, the Legionaries, though small in number, with incomparably smaller means at their disposal, succeeded in winning the victory and spreading panic among our adversaries." End quote. The Legion's electoral victory enabled Codreanu to enter Parliament. He was somewhat apprehensive of going into the lion's den, as he referred to it. Quote, "After the election, I entered Parliament. I was alone in the midst of an enemy world. I lacked the experience of this parliamentary life and the talent of democratic oratory, which is full of empty, pompous, and shiny phraseology, of mere studied gestures, and a large dose of impertinence. The characteristics which help one to succeed here and to rise, God had not endowed me with, perhaps in order to prevent me from being tempted to climb the political ladder." End quote. Codreanu was determined to utilize this new platform to speak his truth to power. He describes how he took the floor one evening as the deliberations were wrapping up and most of his fellow members of parliament had left for the night. Quote, "I tried to tell them that our country had been invaded by Jewry, that where the invasion is the greatest, human misery is the most frightening. In Maramuresh, that the beginning of the Jewish existence on our soil foreshadowed the death of the Romanian people, that as their numbers increased we would die, that finally, as leaders of the Romanian nation, the men of democracy and political parties have betrayed their people in this fight by placing them at the service of great international finance." End quote. Codreanu then proceeded to read aloud from a list that he had prepared of prominent politicians who had taken out loans from Jewish bankers. When he was interrupted and told that the money was to be repaid, he remained unconvinced. Quote, "Whether this will be repaid or not, I do not know, but I tell you one thing. When someone borrows money from such a financial source, he is under an obligation when he comes to power to satisfy it, or, even if he is not in power, to support it, but in any case, to not expose it when it should be exposed." End quote. Then he put forward a number of rather extreme proposals, including the expropriation of all Jewish property, the expulsion of all Jews from the country, and that elected officials found guilty of corruption should receive the death penalty. When someone interjected to argue that the death penalty was against Christian beliefs, Codreanu retorted, quote, "When it is a question of choosing between the death of my country and the death of the thief, I prefer the death of the thief, and I think I am a better Christian if I do not permit the thief to ruin my country and destroy it." End quote. Exposing the corrupt dealings of politicians would be a recurring theme that Codreanu would return to whenever he had the opportunity. This behavior naturally did not endear him very much to his fellow members of parliament, who generally found him to be an incompetent bigot and made no efforts to hide their disdain for him. Although Codreanu's peers in parliament did not take him seriously, the same was not true of the government's ministers. Despite their relatively weak showing in the 1931 general election, their victory in the by-election was a deeply concerning development, especially considering the fact that the organization was still technically outlawed. The Legion had shown that they were potentially something greater than another group of fringe radicals. It was becoming clear that the caprices of local authorities were no longer sufficient to hamper the Guard's efforts. From that point onwards, the ministers of the state resolved to make a more concerted effort to suppress the Legion, using the full array of the forces available to them. It became apparent that things had changed when the Legion attempted to campaign for another by-election in early 1932, this one being in Tutova in western Moldavia. About a month and a half before the election was to be held, the government sent reinforced units of gendarmes to prevent groups of legionaries from reaching the villages where they sought to campaign. As we've seen, Codreanu had been anxious about the prospect of a violent confrontation with the forces of the state, and thus far had been successful in avoiding such an outcome. It was perhaps with this in mind that the gendarmes were not expecting the legionaries to retaliate in the way that they did, because this time the Legion responded to state violence with violence of their own. Codreanu describes some of the street fighting that went on at that time. Quote, "The third team was completely decimated in the Battle of Bakani. There, in a valley entering the village in the evening, it was attacked by a large contingent of gendarmes. The team's leader, Lazar Popescu, was struck over the head with a rifle and was the first to fall unconscious into a pool of blood, but the other legionaries refused to retreat. They counterattacked with their bare chests and nothing in their hands, trying to get into the village. One by one, they fell. The last one standing attacked alone. He fell by his comrades. The entire team lay unconscious in pools of blood. From there, they were dragged through the snow by the gendarmes for better than a mile to the gendarme post in the village. At 1 a.m, a writer brought the news to Barlad of what had happened in Bakani. The team from Iasi, which had arrived in Barlad earlier that night, left immediately on foot to aid their wounded comrades. Following a battle from about 3:30 to 5 o'clock in the morning, during which the gendarmes fired all of their arms, the legionaries occupied the gendarmes' post, finding inside their fallen comrades, still unconscious and lying on the ground. They carried them to the hospital in Barlad. End quote. In the wake of the violence around Tutova, a second attempt was made by the government to dissolve the legion. As Codreanu reports, quote, "Kicked by the gendarmes and attacked by the Jewish press, we were hit by a new dissolution of the guard through a simple ministerial decision. Although we were within the framework of perfect legality, the Iorga government, in defiance of the laws and constitution, dissolved the guard arbitrarily. Our headquarters across the country were again taken over and padlocked, and the print shop in Iasi was closed down. Attacked by the press, we were in the impossible position of not being able to defend ourselves, as all of our publications had been suspended. In Parliament, I tried to speak, but was prevented by the din of the majority, which did not permit me to defend myself." End quote. Despite all of this, the Legion still won the by-election in Tutova by a narrow margin, allowing Codreanu's father, Ion, to join him in Parliament, another important electoral victory for the Legion. The Iorga government fell shortly afterwards, largely thanks to their inability to adequately address the economic issues generated by the Great Depression. A general election was held in July 1932, accompanied by the usual spate of violence and fraud. As Codreanu describes, quote, "The campaign commenced. A new persecution befell our ranks. Spreading out across the large front, our ranks were violently attacked everywhere. Legionaries Savin and Popescu were wounded at Tikhina. At Barlad, scores of teachers and priests were dragged into cellars and maltreated at the orders of the interior minister. At Valusi, our small teams were wounded, likewise at Poldul and throughout Iasi County." End quote. Ultimately, the Legion, still under the provisional name the Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu Group, won 70,000 votes, more than doubling their total from the previous year, and picking up an additional 5 seats in Parliament. Also as a result of this general election, Alexandru Vaida Voivode assumed the office of Prime Minister. As you'll recall, Vaida Voivode was the former Minister of the Interior who had been sacked from his position due to his fascist sympathies. Now that he was back in a position of power, it appears as though his feelings largely remained unchanged. And for the first part of 1933, the state relieved its pressure on the Guard. Codreanu met with the Prime Minister to congratulate him on the victory, during which time Vaida Voivode suggested that the legions should refocus their energy towards some more inoffensive activity, like construction work. Codreanu was keen on this idea, and, as it would happen, an ideal opportunity presented itself earlier that year. The inhabitants of Visani, a village in the southeast of the country, had petitioned the Legion to help them construct a dam to prevent the destructive flooding of a nearby river. Codreanu decided to take full advantage of this opportunity, and on July 10th he issued the following order, quote, "To all Nest and Legionary unit leaders in the country, comrades, never has the problem of light been raised more than in the instance when a man has lost his sight. Likewise, the problem of construction is posed in a particularly pressing fashion at the moment when mankind comes to clearly understand that everything around it is breaking down. When everything is slowly turning to ruin, the human soul turns in an opposite direction, in an attempt to counterattack by manifesting a formidable drive to build from foundations, erect through labor, and construct. Never has this problem of construction been raised in Europe as it is today, when the war period had left us in ruins, and when the post-war period has augmented our ruinous day-to-day lives. In our country, following 15 years of public discourse, pompous but sterile, which have left nothing but ruins, our souls are disgusted with words and seek action. We, too, want to build, from a broken bridge to a road, and the tapping of a waterfall to change it into energy. From a new peasant household to a new type of Romanian village, Romanian town, and state. This is the historic call of our generation, that on the ruins of today, we will build a new and beautiful country. In our country today, the Romanian people cannot fulfill their mission in the world, that of creating its own culture and civilization in Europe. Legionaries, these truths have urged me to call you to the middle of the country, on the shore of the Buzău River. in order to raise with your own arms that huge dam which should carry your names for decades. I ask you so that you can tell the other Romanians who shall build the new Romania. This new Romania cannot be born in clubs, cafes, cabarets, or from the heels worn on city streets and promenades and amusements of the various Don Juans. She will be born out of the heroism of your labor. Comrades, you are on the eve of writing a new page in the history book of legionary battles. The country will look up to you once again as heroes as it has before. Heed then, with your hearts full of enthusiasm, towards the field where a difficult job awaits you, but through which you will make a new sacrifice, thus a new step towards our victory, the legionary Romania. I expect, therefore, all of you on our new field of battle." End quote. Ultimately, about 200 legionaries were mobilized for the dam project. Almost immediately upon arriving at the construction site, they were attacked by a company of gendarmes. Codreanu describes the general state of the legionaries following this most recent battle. Quote, "They rained blows on these young Romanians with as much hatred as though they had been striking at the greatest enemies of the Romanian people. The news of this unheard-of cruelty towards some young people coming to do a good deed, and all of the indignities to which they were subjected, has spread like a black veil over the crushed and worried hearts of our youth, who for their faith and love of country have been betrayed by their politicians to their alien enemy. I understood then that all avenues were closed to us, and that from then on we must prepare for death. We experienced a state of general depression, in which we felt that all of our resources of patience and self-control had at last reached a breaking point. I realized that everything around me was cracking, and that over everything else, if one single slap in the face should occur, it would lead to irreparable misfortune. I felt like crying out from the very depths of my soul, 'We can no longer stand it.'" End quote. Following this most recent incident, Codreanu penned an open letter to Prime Minister Vaida Voivod, which read in part, quote, "Mr. Prime Minister, I call to your attention, in the most respectful manner, that we who know our history and the sacrifices made by each people when it wished to attain a better lot, that we, Romania's present youth, do not refuse the sacrifice. We are not cowards, but I again call it to your attention that I have taught these young men the sentiment of human dignity and honor. We know how to die, and if need be, we shall prove it. You may lock us up, our bones may rot in the prison's depths, we may be shot, but we may not be slapped, we may not be sworn at, and we may not have our hands tied behind our backs. We do not remember that our people, during their sad but proud history, at any time tolerated dishonor. Our fields are full of the dead, but not of cowards. Today we are free men with consciousness of our rights. We are not, nor were ever slaves. We received death, but not humiliation. Rest assured, Mr. Prime Minister, that we cannot withstand these days of humiliation and indignity. Rest assured that after 10 years of suffering, we have built up sufficient moral strength to find an honorable exit from a life that we cannot support without honor or dignity." End quote. From the sentiments expressed in this letter, it was becoming clearer and clearer that Codreanu and the Legion were reaching the end of their tolerance for the mistreatment that they had suffered at the hands of the state. The time for retaliation was nearing, and a new, bloody chapter in the history of the Iron Guard was about to begin. But to hear what happens next, you'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks as we continue the narrative. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else that you would like for me to address, please feel free to send me an email at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Alternatively, it is possible to reach me on Twitter or Facebook. Links can be found in the episode's description. Also, check out the show's website if you get the chance. If you like the show and would like to help keep it going, you can do so by leaving a review for the show on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer, or by purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will be in the episode's description. In any event, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.